And a very good morning to you if you've just tuned in. We're live in London and you're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up, my guests share their views on the week's biggest stories. Charles Hecker and Isabel Hilton are poised. Chuck, what have you spotted? Good morning.
Presidents Zelensky and Trump have had a sit-down in the world's most elaborate office. We'll talk about the meeting in the Basilica of St. Peter.
How about you? What have you spotted, Isabel?
Well, the person who wasn't there was the president of Taiwan, despite the fact that the Vatican does recognise Taiwan. I think there was some diplomatic negotiation.
Thank you for that. We'll be heading to Vienna for the latest headlines.
I'm Alexei, Korolyov, Monocle's Vienna correspondent, and I'll be bringing you the latest from the Austrian capital as voters here head to the polls to choose their next mayor.
Plus, Juliet Linley, our woman in the Vatican, sums up the last 24 hours in Rome. And we hear from our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, in Lisbon. It's the 27th of April, 2025. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you all. If you've just switched on your radio, welcome to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. I have Isabel Hilton and Chuck Hecker sitting around the desk, pouring through a brand new newspaper. Well, it's not a brand new newspaper, but Isabel, you came in and you wanted to know about the newly reconfigured Observer newspaper. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. The room is now filled with print, which is a gorgeous, comforting thing. And we're all trying to sort of not be massively distracted by what's between the pages. What have you spotted?
Well, talking about a new newspaper, James Harding in his Here's the New Observer piece says it's the 12,177th edition of the Observer. It is one of the oldest newspapers, but it's gone into this new chapter, which is pretty controversial. The Guardian pretty much paid Tortoise Media, which is making a loss, to take it on. So there's a big mystery about the economics of it. But actually, the Observer looks pretty much like the Observer. They've got some good names here, got some names that we're used to from the Observer. And I noticed that on the Vatican they have the author of Conclave, who is Robert Harris, talking about Rome and all the drama of the funeral and what's to come. So, here it is. Looks chunky and healthy.
It looks like a newspaper, but it looks thicker than the average newspaper that we pay for now, which
Absolutely.
is always satisfying. It added with a thud. Chuck, you've just come back from America, so we'll be talking to Tyler, our editorial director, about the power of looking up and getting out there and having a look at the world in a minute. But how are you? How's re-entry been?
It's been slow, slow and sleepless. And I was just reminded of how vast a country the United States is. You honestly tend to forget. But I was in 3 separate climactic zones during my trip. Freezing cold in New York City, sweating in Miami, and eating outdoors in March in Austin, Texas, and then shifting among all 3 of those locations. And the country's absolutely vast, although I'm very happy to be back to the confines of London and readjusting to myself to life the way it used to be.
Welcome back. Let's head to Lisbon now to join our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, bathing in glorious Portuguese sunshine. Good morning, Tyler.
Bom dia, good morning. Good morning, Charles. Good morning, Isabel. Good morning, Emma.
How's it going over there? We're having a lovely time with a new newspaper, which I'm sure we're sort of making your fingers itch to start turning some pages.
Exactly. You're making me very jealous, Isabel. I'm so keen to see a copy. I miss those days when maybe a copy of The Observer would have been loaded onto a freighter at 11 o'clock Saturday evening when it came off the press and would have landed in Lisbon by now and might have even made its way to some kiosks. But those days are long gone. It would be great, of course, if they were, even digitally printing it here. And I have to say, this is one of the, I've been out in the world. I don't want our listeners to think that I've been somehow grounded or landlocked here in Portugal. Of course, I was out in Southeast Asia this week. And one of the amazing things was passing through Dubai Airport. And, of course, many airlines do not have much print. You go into a lot of airline lounges, and they have magazine covers pasted to the walls with QR codes where you can download the digital version of the magazine, which, can sometimes be satisfying if you're really desperate. But of course, you do want a bit of paper and ink on the finger. But here's the amazing thing. In the Emirates Lounge, they have an extraordinary digital printing business with obviously someone in the UAE, and they have virtually, not quite every newspaper from around the world, but they had the Miami Herald, they had the Los Angeles Times, they had Die Presse, they had Welt, they had Le Monde, and just stacks and stacks of them, all printed digitally in sort of varying formats. They weren't all quite the same trim size. They're a little bit washed out because it's not the richness of coming off a newspaper press. But I'm feeling this morning, I wish I would even sort of go for a digi-printed version of the relaunched Observer, just to get a sense of it.
It looks nice. It packs a weight to it, which I mentioned a moment ago, that you don't get with newspapers anymore. It feels like a newspaper from the early 2000s.
Good. That's exactly what we want. Early 2000s or even pre that.
Good. Glad to hear it. And with Dubai, do you ever get that moment that you actually sort of hoover up all the newspapers, take them on the plane and then carry them with you for hours and hours and hours? Because when you've been travelling, your head is so jet lagged you can barely string words together.
Oh, listen, I've got the last three New Yorkers traveling with me, The Economist, How to Spend It. So it's and I have to say I've got all of those newspapers because that journey started in Lisbon, went to Dubai, went on to Jakarta, and then Jakarta, Singapore, Doha, back to Lisbon, and yeah, the Miami Herald is still with me. I don't know if I will ever look at it, but I have sort of peeled back the pages of course some titles. But it is amazing though. You have better biceps at the end of these trips.
They do. They go for long travels with you, and you're never entirely sure where you take them with you. How is Lisbon this morning?
It's absolutely beautiful. Quiet streets, gorgeous skies. I think a month of rain. It's finally gone, and it was glorious yesterday, coming in from Qatar, and I think it's going to be maybe the warmest day of the year. This year. I don't know where the parakeets are this morning. I have not seen them. I did see them yesterday. They were back, but beautiful and super busy week ahead. We leave Lisbon and head to Paris and back to Zurich and many places in between.
And indeed, I mean, before we move on to the big events of last week, namely in Jakarta, a quick question must be asked. We need an update, please, on the irrigation system on the balcony.
Oh, listen, I came back, and speaking of being in Indonesia, it felt like we could have been in sort of deepest Java. It is working just fine. Of course, aided by the fact that, the rain sort of abated probably by the time I left at the start of the week, but the jasmine is looking good. The fake banana trees, that's fake meaning that there. I have to look up what a faux banana tree is, because it is something. Maybe it just doesn't produce bananas. It's not fake in the sense that it's plastic. It is a real banana tree. Well, it's a fake banana tree, but I didn't get to the bottom of it with the people at the nursery.
Okay, we'll obviously press for updates next.
Come back to that. We will.
That's next Sunday. We need a banana tree update. Right, this week. You're back in Lisbon, having been in Lisbon last week, but managed to fit in the Chiefs conference in Jakarta. A big first for Monocle.
Well, yes, a big first in the sense that for 2 years in a row, we stayed in the same region. We were in Hong Kong last year, and then we decided to go a little bit further south and found our way to Jakarta. And what was interesting though was how many, not just of the Monocle crew had never been to Jakarta. I mean, many had been, of course, to Indonesia. Of course, most of those people to Bali, and that includes Andrew had never been before. Our Sophie Grove had not been, so that was interesting. And then, but the same for the delegates. I think there was that sense of just of surprise. People, I think, felt maybe some sort of level of comfort, the fact that we could be their hosts, of course, along with our Indonesian hosts as well, to help them navigate the city, to understand at least part of the Indonesia and part of the Jakarta story as well.
And one of the things that was highlighted was the importance of looking up. You were put on the spot while on the stage, weren't you? And it sort of made you have to focus on just what is so important about getting out there and having a look at what the world can offer.
Well, we had just a variety of course, great panels, about 25 different speakers. I had really the good fortune to speak to Najwa Shihab. She has 70 million Instagram followers. She is the most celebrated broadcast journalist. I sort of liken her to being somewhere between sort of Oprah, Barbara Walters, and Christian Amanpour. A real force. Someone who, of course, really grew up in traditional broadcast journalism, and now has set up really her own network, her own media brand. And it was fun because we were talking during the speakers dinner the night before. She was, maybe we should have sort of really make it sort of a ping pong session, and she said, you can throw all the questions, I'll throw some your way. And of course, I was doing all of the interrogating across 25 minutes. But at the very end, as we were wrapping, she goes, I've got a question for you. And that question was, how do you do what you do? And of course, in our business, Emma, we're always conscious of the clock. We try to run our conference very, very tight to the second. So I was on one side sort of conscious, of course, hitting the mark at the same time, wanting to be polite and, of course, answer the question. But it really sort of made me pause, like, how do we do what we do? And it struck me. I was thinking about just the journey in from Jakarta Airport. I think one of the key things is well, first is just showing up. That's one thing. I can say even the conference speaks to it. It's not something that you could join remotely. You had to make the journey to Indonesia to be part of it. And the second part, aside from just showing up, it's also arriving in a place and getting off your screen and looking out the car window, or wherever you may be in the world, looking out the train window. That's not the case coming in from Jakarta Airport. And just interrogating what you see, analyzing what you see, questioning it, admiring it. And I think that is when I think about what do we do at Monocle. And I mean, we're not unique in the world of journalism, but sometimes I think increasingly, there's a lot of comment out in the world. There's a lot of armchair reporting, but to be able to go and navigate a city, a country, to speak to people. And to just get off your screen and absorb is what we do.
Tyler, if you don't mind, I'm going to bring in Charles Hecker because he's just come back from a 6-week tour of America, and you learned an awful lot about. There's a lot of armchair reporting. I think we'll all agree about what's happening in the United States, and you saw it for yourself, and it knocked you sideways.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just have to sympathize with what Tyler's been saying about getting off your screen, because I visited Austin, Texas for the first time, and after having been on a plane for a few hours, you get into your taxi, and the first thing you want to do is switch on your screen and catch up on emails. And I was in a brand new city that I'd never been to before. And I thought, no, put down your phone and look out the window of your taxi. You're in a place for the first time. And that happens very rarely in life. And Austin has this absolutely brand new glittering skyline. It's a city that the tech boom has built over the past 10 to 15 years. And it was really something to take in from a highway that sort of loops you around the skyline in fairly elaborate fashion. But 6 weeks in the United States is very bad for the waistline, but very good for the geopolitical mind. And that is that the overwhelming impression that I got after that tour of the U.S. was one of overwhelming chaos. Washington is in a complete state of disarray, and the rest of the country, as it observes Washington from close by or from a greater distance, is equally at sea about what to make of the absolute whiplash-inducing politics of the Trump White House.
And Tyler, we've talked about this a couple of times. I mean, from your experience now out in Indonesia in the last week or so, is there a sense that whiplash is being able to be compartmentalized because it's on the other side of the world, and Indonesia and the rest of the region can try to focus a bit more on itself?
Part of it, and this was really something that we talked to our speakers about as well, because here we had, of course, delegates flying in from Australia, from Japan, from Saudi, from the UAE, from UK, Switzerland, all over the world. So I thought, on one side, we wanted to make sure that we were able to bring stories to life, to of course hear people's stories, which didn't have to do with tariffs, that did not have to go through the lens or the prism of Washington. And I think we did that up to a point, but of course, it is very, very difficult. And this is where, on one side, the U.S. can talk about sort of decoupling itself from nations, whether that's through pulling back on military support, geopolitical support, diplomatic representation. But it's very complicated. But I would say when we spoke to, I think, many Indonesian entrepreneurs who are running hospitality businesses, those could be hotels, those could be restaurant groups of 30 plus, restaurants and bars, etc. I think there is that sense of just an enormous country as well, and you look at sort of the breadth of the Indonesian archipelago. There's much you can be getting on with, and tariffs or no tariffs, much of what happens in Washington doesn't need to impact you. And of course, Indonesia has its own set of problems, a shrinking middle class, and certainly, obviously a very busy neighborhood as well in terms of what are the interests of China as much as, what does this mean, and more, I would say, what does it mean for Australia with a large neighbor like Indonesia. So there is that sense, and I think, again, we did not try to deliberately steer the conversation away from all that is coming out of Washington. But I think it was also our job to also sort of talk about that level of not just achievement, but I think what are the opportunities if you are a business, if you are a broadcaster, if you're in the cultural sphere, in of course, I think what really just feels like one of the most dynamic regions in the world. I had not been to Jakarta for 9 years, and again, a little bit, Charles, I sort of, when I think about Austin right now, and it's been even longer, I've probably been to Austin for 11 years, and probably at that point, some of those, towers were just going up or weren't even at the planning stage. So I still sort of think of a somewhat low-rise city, but right there, you sort of just change impressions. And the same thing with Jakarta is as well, is just, of course, a booming city on so many levels. A little bit chaotic, but as Andrew sort of said in his column, if you know the right scooter company to call, and listen, and if you land at the right time, I heard stories, of course, colleagues that took 90 minutes to get in from the airport, but I took off. I landed just before 11 o'clock on Tuesday evening. I was at the hotel in 25 minutes, and left very, very bright and early. It wasn't quite a straight to plane, Emma. It was very close. And that was, again, out to the airport in 25 minutes in the morning. And I was going to say, it's probably on an end point on this. It's also just, going to a place, arriving in a city where things are, of course, your impressions are the world's biggest Muslim country. Last time I was there, I remember that things were a little bit more hushed, that the nightlife, you did not sort of feel like elsewhere in Southeast Asia, didn't feel like a Bangkok. But now, actually, it almost felt like this is a place that rivals Bangkok, that bars were open till all hours. And the Jakartans take some pride in saying, we are the last capital city in Southeast Asia where you can still smoke in a bar, in a club, indoors. And let me tell you, I don't want to sort of tattle on the delegates at our conference. I would say, who knows, maybe half of them have the occasional cigarette, and the other half, certainly maybe don't smoke. But when we had our lovely drinks in the evening, I have to say, just the novelty of everyone being able to have a cigarette indoors, not to mention, of course, clove-scented Indonesian cigarettes. Everyone had a cigarette in their hand.
Incredible. Briefly, let's touch on the next big project, looking up, getting out there, but this time to Spain.
Yes, we announced on stage, it's official, listeners. We are heading to Barcelona early September, 4th to 6th. We will be in Barcelona for our Quality of Life Conference, 10th edition of the Quality of Life Conference. Just wonderful, because we did, it's normally the Quality of Life Conferences have happened sort of this time of year. They've been anywhere from sort of April till June, but we've tried some autumn editions. They've worked well. I think that because we have such a big U.S. Base, people like that it is in and around, of course, Labor Day as well. It occasionally obviously works with the UK bank holiday as well. So yes, we'll be turning up in Barcelona. We haven't quite announced where the side trip is going to be. I imagine our Andrew Tuck, of course, almost becoming the unofficial expat mayor of Palma. We might be heading to Palma afterwards, which would be wonderful. But that's the next big significant date in the calendar. But before that, Emma, of course, we've got a great event, a market that we're doing, actually, a Portuguese market with some of the best people and minds in the design world in London. We have the body market coming up in Zurich. And then we have the 10th anniversary of Monocle having its outpost in Südtirol, and we will be in Merano in mid-July as well. So those are the main dates for everyone's diaries.
No one's staying still for very long. Tyler Brûlé in Lisbon, thank you very much indeed for joining us on a sunny Sunday morning. Jack, let me just bring you back in a tiny bit on this trip to the United States. This sense of panic. You told me a story before we came on air about having a meal with friends who were sort of tentatively wondering what was happening next, and by the end of it, when you returned to have lunch with them or dinner with them again, it was a very different state of mind.
That's right. At the beginning of a 6-week trip to the United States, dinner with friends was a sort of, well, this too shall pass, and we'll have an election in another 4 years, and of course there's midterms coming up in 2 years, and the wheel just keeps on turning. 6 weeks later, after a very tumultuous geopolitical period and also a very, very distressing domestic political stretch, the attitude had changed, and dinner conversations towards the end of the trip were sort of like, we're kind of panicking, and the only thing that we need to really figure out is just how much we should be panicking. And the point that you've made is that in your book, which you've just toured around America, I'm sure we won't, and this is why he's been away, you sort of end it on the possibilities of re-entry into Russia for the United States, for lots of American firms. Was there a sense that people are readying to be more, to have a sort of like to be more prepared to go back into Moscow? Yeah, I mean, the United States is very clearly on a path of normalization in its relations with Russia, in stark contrast to the mood as it remains in Europe. And American companies, down to every last one of them, really all of the American companies that left Russia at the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, are now talking about going back. Not all of them will, but at least every one of them is talking about it. And they're talking to their lawyers, and they're talking to their bankers, and they're talking to their risk consultancies, and they're talking to their PR agents in preparation for a move back into Russia. It was also genuinely head-spinning to see how American businesses have essentially done a 180 on Russia. There will be some that will say never again and won't go back. But I was a little bit surprised to see how keen everyone was to at least have the discussion. Your reaction to that, Isabel, given the fact that you've just spent the week doing Chinese focus, you're doing a big Chinese conference yesterday, and the fact remains that this is the idea that despite whatever any leader is saying at any given point, the wheels of trade do continue to turn. They do continue to turn. There is that sort of lingering, who knows what's in Washington's mind, but, this reverse Kissinger has been, much touted. I think it's a non-starter because for Russia to have a quarrel with China would be the last thing that would serve either of their purposes. And in the vacuum that was created when American companies left at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, who rushed in? Well, it's Chinese cars on the streets of Moscow now. It's Chinese everything, actually. That's been a big opportunity for China, and they have filled it. Of course they have. So I'm not quite sure. Chuck will know better than I, but I'm not quite sure what the prospects really are for American companies. And, we're coming up to 100 days. It's 100 days in 2 days' time of the Trump administration. And the reviews are not great. And there is that sort of weariness with unpredictability and the sense that this, bold start is failing, that Trump is, trimming, and pretty much everything he's tried has crashed and burned. So I think that we're in for a bit of a hangover in the next period in the United States. But whether that affects business, I don't know. And is this a golden moment for China? The fact that people have been suggesting that if the United States is going to pull the shutters down on China, China will do very nicely for itself, given the fact that it has everything that it needs to survive without the States. Almost. I mean, the things that it doesn't have, which are some high-tech
some, chips, etc. But they have managed to, get a triangular trade going there. They seem to have, survived the effort to limit the export of advanced technologies pretty well. What they don't have, of course, it's very hard to find a market as big as that of the United States, overnight. But one of the things that this may well precipitate in China is some real action on the 10-year ambition to grow the consumer market. That's going to require pretty radical economic and fiscal changes in China. It is theoretically doable. But, it's not that China thinks it's going to win here, but what China is looking for are areas that they can play to their advantage. Being the steady, responsible global power, being the friendly neighbour in the region, being the country that isn't going to rip up an agreement that they've just negotiated. All of these things play to China's advantage. Although, again, we have to qualify that by noting that the Chinese economy is also in deflationary moment. So nobody wins, as they say in Beijing, from a trade war.
Looking at back to the United States, the fact that we now have, let's look at tomorrow's snap elections in Canada. We have the prospect of Mark Carney coming in, the Conservatives are doing pretty well and they're sort of like catching up with him a teeny tiny bit. But the idea that the next Prime Minister of Canada will have to do two jobs. He, because it's going to be a man, he will have to not only govern a country which is divided, was divided before Trump came in, but he will have to navigate Donald Trump as well. And one wonders, if we look at the context of how other countries have dealt with him, what an approach that could actually work might be. I mean, he's come out pretty loud and proud by saying, we are going to stand up to this, despite the fact that, Trump is reiterating the prospect of Canada becoming the next state of the, within the United States. But what are your thoughts on this one? I know that you wanted to sort of like look at the Canadian elections, Isabel, and just looking ahead to what role Canada might play here.
Well, again, if you remember, in Trump 1, Trump tore up the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and negotiated the USMCA, which was another version of it. This is the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Trump, too, he comes in and looks at it and says, this is the worst agreement ever. Who negotiated this? Well, answer, you did. So, what does a country do with a government like that, which is hardly rational, hardly predictable? My sense, Carney's a pretty solid citizen, and my sense of what he will do if he wins this election is, to hang tough and hope that at some point some adults do get into the room in Washington. And my sense is they may well. This trimming that Trump, this chaos that Chuck has described, this can't go on forever, but without intervention. And I think that Carney knows that, and I think he will hang back until some order and sense prevails. And actually, you're seeing a lot of people doing that. That awful speech that Trump made, saying that
which awful speech?
The one about people queuing up to kiss his rear end. Do you remember that one? It was at the beginning of the tariffs, and he said, there was a huge queue of foreign leaders, etc., wanting to negotiate, begging to negotiate trade agreements. That did
sort of happen at the IMF this week, were it not for the fact that the IMF turned round and said tariffs are going to be terrible for everybody, worst of all for the United States.
Yeah, well, and actually, how many trade deals have been announced since then? It's just not going to happen.
One of the great ironies of all of these trade negotiations is that Trump was about to announce the reaching of a massive trade agreement with South Korea. The United States already has a trade agreement with South Korea. And in fact, it is a tariff-free trade agreement. There is absolute free trade between the United States and South Korea. Trump put tariffs onto that relationship and then decided to enter negotiations to remove them. And so, Isabel's absolutely right to point out that the 100-day anniversary, the 100-day moment is coming up. in the Trump administration. This is one of the typical sort of milestones in how we judge the success of a presidency. It feels like it's been 100 years already. But the Trump presidency has suffered a number of very important reversals, and primarily by shooting itself in the foot. And that is that the reversals, or at least the pause on tariffs, the reversals on the revocation of foreign students' visas. And, Trump's popularity is cratering, even among Republicans. And his approval ratings for his stewardship of the American economy are hovering somewhere in the high 30%, which is very low. And in fact, his ratings are the lowest of any president in his first 100 days. And so, there are three potential breaks on the Trump presidency. The first is the Democrats, and they've done absolutely nothing. The second is the courts. And they've been a bit 50-50 on sort of blocking or not blocking Trumpian initiatives. And then the third thing is the midterms. But we still have a good almost 2 years to wait for those to come through. You
raised a very good point insofar as was a conversation I had earlier on this week with a friend who just went, how is Trump allowed to get away with all this? Because it's that idea that the Supreme Court is doing what it can, but law takes time. But there is no time to find an emergency handbrake on any of this, is there, Charles?
No. And, the Democrats remain in complete disarray, genuinely, since their defeat in November. There hasn't yet been an individual to emerge to unite the Democrats. On the sort of micro level, they're doing one very interesting political thing, and that is that they are holding town hall meetings in Republican districts. And this is because Republicans have been afraid to meet their own public, for fear of just an eruption of anger, or perhaps an eruption, as has happened in a couple of instances, of violence. So what the Democrats are saying is, your own leaders who you elected are afraid to meet you. We will. And they are absorbing Republican rage on the local level. But genuinely beyond that, at the Washington or federal level, the Democrats have yet to reassemble themselves after November. And, the clock is ticking on that.
We've gone back to Trump, as these conversations tend to, but just another thought about Canada, which is it's a very interesting election, which I think will be studied for a long time, because of course Trump's intervention, completely backfired. Canny is well ahead. But the other very odd thing in Canada is that when the Canadian government some time ago put a tax on the platforms using news, a charge. So when the platforms like Meta use news, they were expected to pay for it. It's a very sensible move, except that Meta then stopped putting news on the platform. And the curious thing is that Canadians don't seem to have noticed. They say, all the polls say, yes, I get a lot of news from social media. They don't seem to have noticed it's not there anymore. So I think that this whole question of what is influencing political thought and ideas in our democracies in this very bewildering age, I think, this Canadian election is going to be a bit of a classic case, which will be studied.
And it happens tomorrow. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Joining me in the studio, Charles Hecker and Isabel Hilton. Let's head now to another election in Vienna. Today, district leaders will be elected, including the local council and the mayor. The Social Democrats, the party that's governed the city almost without interruption for decades, is expected to retain the mayorship. Monocle's Alexei Korolyov will be talking to him in a moment. But first, he's taking a closer look now at an often overlooked aspect of elections in Vienna.
Guten Abend, wir begrüßen Sie ein weiteres Mal aus dem ZIP Newsroom und mit dem Ausgang der Wien-Wahl.
1,1 Millionen Menschen. When Vienna last went to the polls in autumn 2020, the question of who could and couldn't vote barely came up. The COVID pandemic was in its early stages, and for most people, little else seemed to matter. But that question can no longer be brushed aside.
We have in Vienna the special situation that it's a rapidly growing city. But at the same time, the rate of people who can participate at elections is rapidly sinking.
That's because in Austria, the right to vote at almost every level of government is tied to citizenship.
Austria is at the very end in Europe concerning access to citizenship. The rates of persons becoming citizens is one of the lowest in Europe. So we got more than 600,000 persons living in Vienna, but who are not eligible to vote. And this is a problem.
Alexander Pollack works with the NGO SOS Mitmensch. To highlight the issue, the organisation holds a symbolic vote for non-Austrian residents during major elections. It's called Pass Egal, meaning no matter the passport.
And we saw that this is really something very moving for those who participate. And on the other hand, we want to show a clear sign to politics that we need change, that we need an inclusive democracy where all people who live here, that they have a right to vote.
Among those calling for change is Viennese spoken word artist Yasmin Hafed, better known by her stage name, Yasmo.
I was born in Vienna and I've lived my whole life in Vienna. I pay taxes, I pay social security, and I'm not allowed to vote because I don't have the citizenship. And it's not easy to get an Austrian citizenship, which makes absolutely no sense because we are living in the European Union. I mean, I understand if somebody comes here for 3 months and they are not supposed to vote because they don't have anything to do with the country and then they leave again, I get that. But I don't know, something like after a year or after 5 years or something, it's just impossible to think about having 2/3 vote for you because you are not allowed to participate in democracy. Yeah.
Well, let's hear now from Alexei, who's in Vienna. Grüß Gott, Alexei. How's the Austrian capital looking this morning?
It's looking good. It's looking good. I mean, except for, all those people who feel excluded today, obviously.
Obviously, yes. But for those who can actually participate in the elections today, just summarise who we're voting for and what the political situation is in Vienna.
So Vienna is Vienna is unique in sort of the Austrian political landscape because, it is a city and it is a province in its own right as well. And it has historically voted differently from how people vote at the national level. So as I said earlier there in the item, the Social Democrats have always been at the helm in Vienna for more than a century now. I mean, with certain exceptions, and so they are expected to retain the mayorship again. Which is, very different to how people vote, how Austrians vote nationally. It's usually the Conservative People's Party or the recent, at the risk of sounding incredibly impartial, the far right threat that has been deflated. The far right were about to. Or it was a possibility that the far right might head the government, the national government, which didn't happen, thankfully, again, at the risk of sounding very impartial. So usually the Social Democrats rule supreme in Vienna in recent decades in combination with another party. Recently, it's been the Greens or the Neos, the Liberal Party. So this will probably remain the case. In Vienna. But obviously, the bigger problem is that problem that I highlighted in the item there, is that increasingly so many people in Vienna are excluded from voting. It currently stands at 36% of the population, which is incredible. And this figure is almost doubled over the past 2 decades. So if this trend continues, it's just not sustainable. And Austria or the Viennese government, rather, they have to do something about it.
I mean, have they made any efforts to try to address this for this election, given the fact that if you have a third of the electorate disenfranchised, you might be able to question the validity of a poll?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, this did come up in the run-up to the election, and the current mayor, who hopes to remain mayor, Michael Ludwig of the Social Democrats, he had to address it in a press conference recently, and he reiterated this the idea that actually the majority of the parties share, except perhaps for the liberal ones, that the right to vote must remain a citizenship right. That's what he said. But then the question then, if that is so, then, very logically, people are saying, then make it easier for people to obtain Austrian citizenship, because Austrian citizenship is really, as again, we heard in that item, and I spoke to those people, it's really not easy to get, and Austria is one of the countries that doesn't allow dual citizenship. So, if you want to get Austrian citizenship, you have to automatically give up your original citizenship, which not many people are prepared to do, or, I don't know. But it is generally not easy to get Austrian citizenship. And so, that automatically makes it very hard for you to get the vote.
Tell us about the pace at which all of this happened. I mean, you described there sort of a rather long journey to making sure that that everybody gets a chance to vote. But Isabel was talking a moment ago about the idea of social media being the source of everybody's news in Canada, even though social media isn't actually putting much news up there. And one perhaps mistakenly might believe that Vienna is one of the last places on earth where people actually sit down and talk about it and discuss things, given its reputation and its history. Is there a sense that Vienna still luxuriates in taking its time here?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, there are all those stereotypes and cliches about Vienna that, things... like whatever happens in the world then happens 50 years later in Vienna or something, or 30 years. I mean, I don't remember the exact. It was a quote from somebody, but it is true that generally Vienna and Austria in general, it takes a very long time to get somewhere, but this again, the disenfranchisement debate that thankfully has been sort of. At least in the left and liberal media, it has been discussed recently. It is a topic. It is something that people are talking about, which is great. You have to start somewhere. It may take another 10 or 15 years, or 2-3 elections for us to get there. But it is slowly happening, I think. I mean, Austria needs to catch up because, of course, Vienna. Recently, I think there are now about just over 2 million people in Vienna, and that happened, I think, last year that Vienna crossed that threshold. And Michael Ludwig, the mayor, and all the city officials are constantly talking about how Vienna needs fresh talent, international talent. Well, then make it easy for them to be here and to live here, because of course Vienna, as we see in our quality of life surveys every year, Vienna ranks very highly when it comes to quality of life and standards of living, and people want to move here. But then, obviously, that may not be the first thing on your mind when you move to a city, right? So your right to vote or your right to sort of choose how the city is governed. But obviously, at a certain point, it hits you, and you want to participate. But then you need to give the people this right.
Alexei Korolyov in Vienna, thank you so much for joining us on the line. Charles, just listening to what Alexei was saying, it reminded me of a comment that we heard a few months ago about the speed at which Europe operates, and it still believes that it lives in a Viennese coffee house.
It's a slower place. There's something that sounds very charming to say that everything that happens in Vienna happens 30 to 50 years later than everywhere else. Again, in my sort of recent comparisons between the United States and Europe, I was reminded that the U.S. is a sort of live to work sort of place, and Europe is a work to live sort of place. And I think I fall squarely into the second of those two camps, and that Europe acts politically, economically, and socially in a way that is, well, it seems obvious to say, entirely unique when compared to the United States, and that, the countries of Europe are more similar perhaps than they are different when it comes to these sorts of things. It's a slightly more gentle place to live, I think.
Let us head to a place now which saw the most amazing of ceremonies, which delved deep into the past yesterday with a touch of modernity to a certain degree. One must concede. The funeral of Pope Francis took place yesterday. Juliet Linley, our woman in the Vatican, well, not necessarily in the Vatican, Juliet, freshly off the plane back in Zurich in our studios in Dufourstrasse 90 after what must have been a remarkable weekend. A very good morning to you, Juliet. How are you doing?
Buongiorno, Emma. Very good morning to you too.
So yesterday, the world saw Rome and the world saw history reenacted in front of our eyes. This astonishing moment when everybody is catapulted to one of the most beautiful historical cities, but one of the most astonishing ceremonies that can be witnessed on earth, which is the funeral of a pope.
It was indeed a momentous occasion, Emma. It felt very historic to be there for me, especially because I've been covering Vatican affairs since 20 years ago, which was actually when, in 2005, Pope St. John Paul II passed away. So there was a lot of, in my personal view, there were a lot of comparisons in my head that were going on between that funeral and this one. And just being there in the midst of these throngs of pilgrims, it was powerful. And you know, Emma, there were so many teenagers, because this was supposed to be the Jubilee for teenagers at the Vatican this very weekend. They were coming, and as I talked to them, of course they came anyway, but instead of being there for the canonization, for the creation of a 14-year-old boy who was to become a saint, they were there for a funeral, a papal funeral that doesn't come around very, very often. Now that canonization was cancelled, or shall I say it was postponed, simply because if you don't have a pope, you cannot create a saint. And right now we are in the interregnum. We're between two popes. We're between Pope Francis and the person who we don't know yet shall be chosen to be Peter's successor. And that's a whole story that the Italian press have been full of, not just the Italian press, international press, full of questions. Who will it be? Will it be someone who will be a progressive that will continue in Francis's vein, that will be Pope Francis II, or will there be a pendulum swing to the opposite end? And will it be someone conservative, someone who wants to bring the papacy back to its more traditional days, rather than what is perceived as bringing the papacy forward into perhaps too much into modern time in the views of some traditionalists?
And one wonders how everything was balanced yesterday from where you were in Rome. The fact that clearly you have to mark the end of an era of one papacy when you have the burial of Pope Francis in Santa Maria Maggiore. How much is the forthcoming conclave being discussed, given the fact that there remains, another 8 days of mourning before the conclave can actually come together?
Well, it's being discussed amongst people who are purely speculating, because neither you nor me nor any member of the press nor even any cardinal can know what lies ahead. But certainly there are also congregations being held, and they will start as of today in more intensity. And those are meetings between the cardinals to get to know each other. There are 135 who are eligible to vote because they are under the age of 80, but actually 2 have already said they cannot make it for health reasons. So we're looking at 133 if no others drop out, if you want, along the way. But they need to be able to discuss within themselves. And it is, in a way, as someone put it, it's a political campaign, if you want, to see who will be the next head of the church. And interestingly, because Pope Francis appointed, I think it's 80% of the total number. A lot of them come from what he liked to call the peripheries. And because they came from such far-flung places, a lot of them don't know each other at all. You know, perhaps in past times, most of them would have been Italian, European, but certainly not so many from Asia, from Africa. And this very fact that they don't know each other so well is going to be a bit of a hindrance. So they have another 8 days, as you said, as part of the Novendialis, which began yesterday, to have their meetings to discuss, and if you want to put it, for the politicking to start, and for the different, I don't want to call them factions, but for the different groupings, the moderates, the progressives, the conservatives, to see how many votes they can get. You need a 2/3 majority in order to choose the next pope, and so on. It's very exciting if you think about it. No one would ever thought that Vatican news could be exciting, but in this very moment, actually, even the secular press are fascinated.
Oh, I think we all absolutely love a bit of Vatican update. Just looking at the kind of pope that they're going to choose, I think that one of the huge issues is the fact that Francis pushed it in such a progressive direction. Some say not far enough, but others say far too far. And there will be those who are clamouring for a return to the likes of Pope Benedict and his very, very conservative approach.
That's true. And if you look at the breakdown, though, there were people Vaticanists speculating that there perhaps wouldn't be enough of the conservative ilk, of the extreme traditionalists, to manage to get a 2/3 majority to vote someone who would be extremely conservative. And then, the others were saying maybe a bit of continuity, but in moderation. And that could possibly be the Pope's number 2, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who has been to all the far-flung places of the aforementioned cardinals, and therefore knows most of these cardinals far better than any of the others. And in a time in which there is so much turmoil on the international political scene and geopolitics, conflicts in several hotspots around the world, many are wondering whether the cardinals will look for someone who is active on the political scene or on the diplomatic scene, and that could be a Pietro Parolin.
And there's also that fact that they don't like to choose them too young in case they're in post for too long.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, in fact, they're looking at a lot of sort of in their 70s is considered young. You don't want to go for a 79-year-old to the next year. Well, but nowadays people's health is very different to what it was in the old days, and this is a church that's been around for centuries. And people are looking for huge changes. Huge changes don't come about so easily. We've seen hundreds of popes come and go, Emma.
Thank you so much, Juliet Linley in Zurich. We all watched the funeral yesterday. Or did you watch it, Isabel? Or were you dealing with China?
I'm afraid I missed it. I've only had bits, but I'm looking forward to catching up. It looked fantastic.
It was fantastic, and that idea. The thing that I noticed is that we couldn't stop but make incredibly obvious comparisons with the funeral of the Queen in the United Kingdom a couple of years ago, when they had the coffin, the pallbearers, absolutely marshalled to within a second of their lives to walk at a certain pace, to pick things up at a certain second. Whereas if you looked at what happened in Rome yesterday, these were pallbearers who were in suits. Some of them had sunglasses on. Not all of them kind of felt as if they were totally in control of what was going. It was the most Italian thing ever. And one person I was sitting watching it with said it looked like a bunch of Sicilians who'd just stolen a sofa. It was terrible.
No one in shorts, exactly.
No one quite in shorts.
I read somewhere, yesterday I was bit by the spring cleaning bug, so I was up to my eyeballs in sort of domestic rubbish and had to give the ceremonies in the Vatican a pass. But
you were cleansing. You were doing your own rituals.
My own sort of, filling my apartment with incense and chasing out evil spirits.
We started to talk in Gregorian chant.
But there's a theory out there, and I read this somewhere in print, and so it must be true, that one of the reasons why Italian fashion, and particularly Italian fashion for men, is so rich in plumage, is that it is mimicking the costuming and the pageantry and the elaborateness of the Vatican and of the uniforms and the outfits and the get-ups, forgive me for being a bit prosaic, of the cardinals and the bishops and the pastors, and just the uniforms that you saw on display, even in the static pictures that you looked at in coverage later, that is one of the things that gave birth to the Italian men's fashion industry.
It makes you swoon. Well, it makes me swoon, Isabel, that regardless of the competence of any official in Italy, I mean, if you just go around a roundabout and you see a police officer, you just think that's the sharpest dressed individual I've ever seen in my life.
Absolutely. I mean, there are two things that I would put up in competition. One is Army Day in Delhi. I have no idea how well they fight, but I can tell you they absolutely win the costume competition. And the other is Highland dress for men, which is pretty. I mean, all the competition in Highland balls is between the men. The women just, wear a dress.
Yes, that's
the
secondary.
Men, the lace, the silver, the dirks in their socks. So, there are ways that men can just. But what it reminded me of, that French. There's a French protest song from Silk Weavers in Lyon, which begins pour chanter Veni Créateur, il faut avoir chasuble d'or. Nous les tissons pour vous et nous, les pauvres canuts, n'avons pas de chemise.
Okay. We bow down.
In other words, we weave all your great silk robes and we don't have a shirt. Yeah.
A 10 out of 10 for instant recall from Isabel Hilton's brain. That was amazing. Let's talk about this incredible picture, which is now dominating all the front pages of all the newspapers, that one would have imagined that if you were trying to predict a newspaper front cover, silly idea, but you would think that a glorious image of the pomp and ceremony of the Pope's burial would be the thing that dominated the pictures. It's not, is it? Who wants to have a go at what we're actually looking at today?
Well, we opened the broadcast with a discussion of the sort of the renaissance of the Observer, and I've got a copy of the Telegraph at my right hand here, and it's not very often that you see the exact same treatment of stories on the Observer and the Telegraph, but there you have it. And what both newspapers and many newspapers have done is that they've taken this absolutely extraordinary picture of President Donald Trump and President Volodymyr Zelensky sitting on essentially sort of what looked like kind of stacking hotel chairs in the middle of St. Peter's Basilica. And Emma, I think you asked the question before we went on air about, I wonder who put those two chairs there and who sort of pushed them in that direction. But there they are, having a sit down, sort of hunched over, literally, physically looking extremely just absorbed in conversation. They sat there for 15 minutes. The newspapers have put this across their front page, and what they've done also interestingly is that they've set their flags, the masthead, in white space across the top of these pictures rather than having it in sort of 60-point black ink like most newspapers normally do. It's a very graphic, very arresting portrayal of this moment. And what's happened there, President Trump apparently emerged from this conversation again with another one of his famous pivots, and that is having spoken to President Zelensky for 15 minutes in splendid isolation in the middle of this magisterial basilica, has gone anti-Putin. Or at least that's what a lot of newspapers are saying. And that Zelensky must have said something to him in combination, of course, with the absolute merciless attack a couple of days ago on Kiev and other parts of Ukraine with long-range missiles from the Russians. President Trump, has finally come to the conclusion that, maybe President Putin isn't all that interested in peace in the first place. What took him this long in those 100 days? What took him this long to realize that? But there we have it.
The idea that Putin is playing him along seems to have come to him again slightly late in the day. But hey, let's not be sour.
Perhaps President Trump is living in Vienna, and it just takes him a little bit longer to catch up on what's happening in the rest of the world.
I sent my sympathy to Vienna. The idea of this immediate one wonders how this conversation came about. It is this amazing image inside the basilica, and you have, like you say, the two red hotel chairs pulled up. One wonders whether this was staged, because some cynics have been suggesting that this was something that was clearly a designed moment, or whether one wonders whether the two men just got together at a phenomenally important moment in history, started to talk, and someone just went, "Can we get a couple of chairs?"
The Observer has a headline on its front page, the lead story, just by these two men, which says "The Pope's Last Act," which I think implies that the Vatican has somehow kind of brought this about. And perhaps they did, because the Vatican is a very wily player of politics.
And we've got 1 minute left to talk about that wily player of politics in Taiwan.
The president wasn't there. The former vice president came. Why? Well, the Vatican does recognize Taiwan as a country, but the late Pope made some very controversial agreements with Beijing over the recognition of bishops. So it's a little bit delicate, and that's perhaps another bit of Vatican politics, that to have the current president of Taiwan there would complicate something else.
Charles, your reaction to that, quickly?
I'm sort of waiting with bated breath for, on behalf of Taiwan to see what happens over the next 4 years of the Trump presidency. I think that these are very, very geopolitically tense times across the straits. Nothing new in saying that, but it's all fresh again now because of who's sitting in the White House.
Indeed, and what happened yesterday in Rome. That's all the time we have for today's Monocle on Sunday. The warmest of thanks to my guests, Charles Hecker and Isabel Hilton, Alexei, Korolyov, Juliet Linley and Tyler Brûlé. The programme was produced by Desiree Bandley and Mariella Bevan. Our studio engineer is Mariella as well. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday returns next week. Tyler's back in Zurich, everybody. But until then, goodbye. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your weekend.